I wanted to let everybody know who's in the room that we will be recording tonight's meeting. The recording has just begun, so it's important for everyone here to know that, in fact, this session will be recorded. We're recording it, obviously, for people who can't attend tonight. The meeting will be posted afterwards so that people can view it on their own time and at their own leisure. So we'll get started shortly, give people a chance to filter in. And we'll get going with the presentation and Q&A in a moment. All right. Thank you for joining us tonight for the 2024 budget consultation. It's a combined consultation, as we did last year, for wards 7, 8, and 9. Tonight, we have the councillors for all three wards on deck. We'll be opening with a few just opening comments from the councillors themselves. Then we'll move on to a presentation from Cyril Rogers, the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer for the City of Ottawa, who will run us through the highlights and the high-level evaluation of what this budget is going to be about. And then once Cyril is finished, we will pass the floor over to you to ask your questions. The format will be a little bit different tonight. Tonight, we obviously have moved completely online. There is no in-person session. That's a good thing on some levels. What that's going to do is help us keep track of all the questions that do come in, document them, and make sure that we're addressing your questions. It also lets us take away a record of what's been asked so that we get a sense of trends and the sense of things that people are concerned with. We're going to do our best to moderate that Q&A, look through it. I'm Tim Avery, working in Sean Devine's office. I'll be doing my best to look through those questions with some help from a variety of other people from other offices. Please be patient. If we don't get to your question right away, we probably will eventually. If for whatever reason we're not hitting it, absolutely feel free to remind us in the Q&A, but we will do our best to cover all the bases. We do tend to get a fair bit of repetition, so you'll forgive me if I wrap your question up in a broader question that addresses a number of questions that come in. But we're going to do our best to try and answer the questions you have, because after all, that's what this is about. This is about you letting your councillors know what's of interest to you, where the question marks are for you, and to try and set you on a path to having the information you need to know what's going on with your city's budget this year. All right. A few ground rules. Again, we just want to make sure that we ensure that people's questions are being asked. Keep in mind that this is a budget consultation. There are all kinds of other opportunities to provide input to your councillors. Our inboxes are evidence of that every day. This session is an attempt to try and address specific questions about the budget cycle and budget process and the budget contents. So if you could do your best to try and keep your questions focused on that topic, that will make the best use of the resources we have available to us tonight. And it will ensure that we are making the best use of Cyril's time. As you can imagine, he spends a lot of time at these meetings over this time of year, and his family will certainly appreciate if the questions are focused on things that he actually knows something about. That would be very helpful. So if we could be respectful to people's time, that would be great. The meeting is scheduled to run until 9 o'clock tonight. Obviously, we may wrap up earlier if we've exhausted the questions, but do keep in mind that we're running on a bit of a clock. So if you do have things to ask, absolutely get them down and we'll make sure they are answered. So that's it. We're going to move into the introductions now. So the three councillors are here. We've got Teresa Kavanaugh from Ward 7, Bay Ward. We've got Lane Johnson here from College Ward, and Councillor Sean Devine from Knoxdale Merivale. And I'll throw it up to you. Who wants to start with opening remarks this week? This year, it's not just this week.
Well, I'll begin because I've got the Indigenous land acknowledgement as well. So, bienvenue à tous et à tous. Je m'appelle Lane Johnson. Je suis la conseillère de la quartier collège et je vous remercie beaucoup d'être ici ce soir. I would like to begin with the land acknowledgement, please. I would like to acknowledge on behalf of the hosts and myself that Ottawa is located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, and we would like to honor the land and the peoples of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, whose ancestors have lived on this territory for millennia and whose culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. Et encore en français, il est important de souligner que la ville d'Ottawa est située sur un territoire non cédé de la nation algonquine Anishinaabe. J'aimerais honorer les terres et les peuples de la nation algonquine Anishinaabe, dont les ancêtres ont vécu sur ce territoire durant des millénaires et dont la culture et la présence ont enrichi et continuent d'enrichir ces terres. So my name is Lane Johnson, and as I mentioned, I am the counselor for College Ward. So I am here west of Ottawa with my colleagues that share some borders. So we're really happy to have everyone here tonight. We decided to pivot online in this circumstance, but we're all interested in hosting online event or in-person events when it's feasible. So do stay tuned to that. And I guess just with respect to the budget for 2024, what's different between when we hosted the 2023 budget consultation at the beginning of 2023 and now? I've been appointed as the Ottawa representative, the second Ottawa representative to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which is the federal body bringing together municipalities across the country to advocate to the federal government for municipality needs. And I think, you know, in the last 10 months, certainly, we have experienced it's unavoidable to see how cities and municipalities are at the mercy, I don't know if that's the right word, but are directly affected by the choices of upper levels of government. So whether that's with planning with the province or with funding with the feds, our property tax model, the way that we receive money as a municipality, was created when, you know, only 10% of people lived in cities and 90% of people lived rurally, and now that's flipped. And the pressure to create infrastructure and sustain infrastructure for a population that is as large as it is, but also mandated to grow, is becoming increasingly impossible through property tax alone. And so when we go into the city's budget, I'll just, you know, offer that as a context where we are, you know, working hard across the country to come together and advocate at other levels of government that the way that we receive revenue within municipalities has to change. It needs to respond to how essential we are as economic drivers and how we are managing to respond, even in really dire circumstances, to the variety of issues that present themselves in cities, whether or not they are our jurisdiction. It doesn't matter. When someone lives on your street and they're a resident, you're going to try and figure out how to support them with the resources that you have. So I'm sure Cyril will speak more about that in his presentation, but I just wanted to offer that context as something that I've really come to understand since we met on this issue 9 months ago. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Councillor Johnson. Next up, Councillor Devine from Ward 9.
Hello everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Mon nom est Sean Devine. Je suis le conseiller pour Ward 9, Knoxdale Merivale. Hello everybody. So I'm really happy to be here tonight with my colleagues and with what I see is a large number of residents attending. So very grateful that you could all attend here. So I'm glad to share this platform with my colleagues. We don't only share borders, as Lane mentioned. We're very like we're very of like mind. So I think you'll appreciate that a lot of the questions that you'll be sending tonight, you'll have 3 sets of ears, hopefully attuned to it. I'll just follow up a little bit of what Councillor Johnson said. Before I get to that, I do want to make sure that for any of my constituents out there listening, I want to continue hearing from you on your priorities for this budget and for the next budget, and I'll tell you why. So please do continue being in contact with me. You can read a lot about my perspectives on things by signing up for my bi-weekly newsletter. So if you don't already, please go to my website, seandevine.ca, and click on that blue sign up button. But also, we are eagerly looking to hear from Ward 9 residents about your thoughts, your priorities and concerns for budget 2024. So please do send us an email to knoxdalemerivale@ottawa.ca and just make the subject line budget 2024. So to follow up on what Lane was saying, but to use the what I heard Tim say earlier, that when they're looking through the questions tonight, we often will see a lot of the same question. I think a lot of the same question is going to be, so why can't we do that? We're in, unfortunately, we're in pretty tight constraints when it comes to our 2024 budget. And I think Cyril will likely illustrate in his own presentation just how little money there is for discretionary spending, and unfortunately just how little money there is for new spending. So I'm already trying to come to grips with the sad reality that we're likely not going to have much new money at all for any new ideas or new things that we might want to prioritize. But I'll just echo back what Councillor Johnson was saying. She's now our liaison for the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. I was fortunate to attend that conference of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities back in May, and they drilled home the theme that municipalities need to enter a new fiscal framework with the upper levels of government. And that's the term that I hope you start to hear and repeat yourselves to your communities, a new fiscal framework where municipalities that, as Lane said, have been shouldering the load for far too long, need to start getting more support from our upper levels of government if we are going to continue providing the services and infrastructure that more and more people need from us. So I look forward to this conversation and to connecting with you all in the coming weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Devine. And now a few words of introduction from Bay Ward Councillor Teresa Kavanagh.
Hi. Well, those are 2 tough acts to follow. It's great that we're having this meeting. First of all, I want to say thank you to everyone for taking the time to come out. You obviously care about your city and you're interested in the issues, and you're making room for it in your busy lives. So thank you very much for that. It's lots of information coming tonight. As it's been previously explained, this is probably a more fulsome budget than in the past, where we were kind of rushed after an election. This time we've had more time to think. Though it's important to know that despite the fact that we're still playing around with the numbers, there's already been a cap put on this budget of 2.5%. So every time we decide we want to spend on something, that means that we're asked to take something away. So of course, that's not a fun thing to do, because we love our services, all of them. So that's one of the things that you have to keep in mind, and that's what we're told all the time. And I have to say, it's pretty tough because there's a lot of demands. Earlier today, I met with community health centers from across the city, and they brought in residents, people who live in social housing, people who are on waiting lists for affordable housing. So we've learned of the struggles they're having. One of the big issues we always look at when we're doing a budget is inequity, and how we can help those who are in particular need. So that's something that we always have to keep in mind, and that's why affordable housing is a priority. I'm proud to be the chair of Ottawa Community Housing. We're trying to build more. We're trying to give more homes to everyone. These are the big questions, and we have to squeeze that in, and you'll see from Cyril, who's going to do a great job, how so many of the budget is spoken for in terms of the things that we absolutely have to do. So I won't hold them up. I think that's a pretty good overview, and thanks again for coming out.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Kavanagh. So for the next section of tonight, what we're going to do is hear from Chief Financial Officer Cyril Rogers, who will walk us through the highlights of the budget this year. Once Cyril's presentation is done, we'll move on to the question and answer portion of tonight. For the presentation, it's going to be delivered in English, and the presentation you're going to see is in English. However, there is a French version of it available, and it can be made available to anyone who wishes to have it. So if you want to get in touch with your respective councillor's office after tonight, if you'd like a French language copy of it, that's just fine. Just get in touch with us and we'll make sure that, that you have it in your hands. All right, Cyril, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Councillor Kavanagh, Johnson, and Devine. I got a tough act to follow. Tim does a great job moderating. I wish he could moderate these more often because he does such a good job. So welcome, everyone. My name is Cyril Rogers. I'm the interim Chief Finance Officer and General Manager of Finance and Corporate Services at the City of Ottawa. I'm also joined, my colleague Suzanne Snob is on the line as well to support if needed once we get into the Q&A section of the presentation. So you can move to the next slide. So this evening, basically, we changed our approach a little bit this year in terms of what we heard coming out of the 2023 budget process. We were trying to get more information in terms of what residents wanted to see, what our councillors wanted to see as we moved into the development of the 2024 budget right after the 23 budget was adopted. And one of the main things that we heard was getting back to municipal budget basics, making the document more digestible, more understandable, more palatable for the normal user, improving the overall process engagement, seeking more public engagement, making the information more friendly, and then of course just covering the kind of the like I mentioned, the overall basics of a municipal budget 101, if you will. Next slide. So this section of the budget, I'm going to touch on several different components. I'll talk about the Municipal Act and the requirements of municipalities in Ontario in terms of balancing a budget. I'll speak to and highlight some of the key differences from some of the terminology that you'll hear throughout the budget process in terms of the operating budget and the capital budget. I'll speak to the funding sources. Councillor Johnson did allude to some of this in terms of, as a municipality, we're limited to what we can actually leverage from a funding source perspective, specifically taxes and other user fees. I'll break down the different tax levies that we do have in the City of Ottawa, and then I'll also speak to what reflects or what represents user fees and charges in our municipal budget. Next slide, please. So again, every year, the City of Ottawa does put forward a budget. It's a requirement as per the Municipal Act. And one of the key foundations of the Municipal Act is that by law, municipalities are required to put forward a balanced budget. And what that simply means is that all the expenditures that we incur must equal to the relevant revenues coming into the system. So money out must equal the money coming in. And that's a requirement stated by the Municipal Act. We cannot budget for a deficit or surplus, unlike our provincial and federal partners. You know, it's very rare that provincial or federal bodies do budget for a surplus, but typically they do budget in a deficit perspective. But from a municipality perspective, we are not allowed or cannot put forward a budget that does not balance. Next slide, please. So two main components of our budget. Our budget, when we talk about our budget, you will see reference to what we consider operating budget versus capital budget. Our operating budget is basically our day-to-day expenditures that we incur to deliver the services across the city. So our normal staff salaries for winter operations, repairs, materials for pothole repairs, all of our park maintenance, emergency protective services, staff salaries, you know, the fuel that it takes to put in our ambulances, all these other components in terms of utilities around our facilities, and those are what we would consider our operating budget. If you compare that to your normal household, that will be your hydro bill, your internet bills, your grocery bills, that will be considered an operating budget expenditure. On the capital side, these are investments where there's a benefit that exceeds 1 year. So these are typically in major infrastructure, what we consider an asset. So our buildings, our roads, all of our roads resurfacing, new sidewalks, new bike lanes, all of our vehicles. Again, things that last beyond 1 year, those are what we consider to be a capital budget line item. Next slide, please. From the funding source perspective, so our operating budget is funded mainly from the property taxes. Property taxes makes up about 53% of our overall revenue that comes into the city. And I will speak to this on the next slides in terms of the citywide tax levy, transit levy, and police services levy. Our user fees and charges, so this is our rate utility bill. So our water bill, that would be considered a user fee. Fare for transit would be considered a user fee. Any programs that you partake in recreational facilities, swimming lessons, skating lessons, those programs, you pay a user fee to use that service. Assessment growth. Assessment growth is basically, very simple terms, any house that does not exist today, but exists tomorrow. So a new house that's built today did not pay taxes in 2023, but that new house will begin paying taxes in 2024 once that house is occupied. We do receive provincial and federal funding. Ottawa Public Health is 70% funded from the province and 30% funded from municipality. Our paramedic services range from 50% province, 50% from the municipality. Our community social services programs, there are significant services there where there's downloaded from the province, so we receive funding for those services. Any of those funding dollars that we receive for those respective services must stay within that service. So if we receive funding from the province for paramedic services, that money needs to support paramedic services. I cannot take that money and divert it to another city service. Payment in lieu of taxes. This is effectively a tax bill from the federal facilities, crown corporations in the city of Ottawa. We do not send a tax bill to our federal partners, but what they do is they make a payment in lieu of those taxes. And then investment income, we do have a treasury team at City of Ottawa where we do have significant investments. We issue debt and debentures and bonds, which generates lots of income for overall, which helps support the overall city budget. On the capital side of the budget, we do make contributions from our operating budget into the capital program. So a portion of the taxes from the property tax bill does go into fund our capital budget. The other big component for our capital budget is what we refer to as development charges. So when a new subdivision or developer comes to the city to pay a permit to build a house, there's fees within that permit that covers the cost of the infrastructure that goes to service that area, like new roads, new pipes to get into that new household. We do have federal and provincial funding agreements with our partners, specifically light rail, stage 1 and stage 2. Those are 1/3 federal, 1/3 provincial, and 1/3 municipally funded. We do issue debt to fund our capital program. And debt is basically the same as a mortgage on your house. So we do take out debt to kind of fund that long-term asset. And then our water program, water, wastewater, that's very heavy tax, capital intensive infrastructure. So that program funds its own capital investments as well. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, we do have 3 different property tax levies, and then of course the rate structure. So the tax supported budget, which is funded by the citywide tax levy, that's our main property tax bill. If you were to look at the back of a tax bill, you would see a transit levy as well. So the transit levy, all the taxes collected for the transit levy need to reside within transit. So we can't take transit taxes and fund non-transit services, much like the police services budget. The police services has its own levy. This is governed by the Police Services Act. And again, taxes contributed to the police services levy need to reside within the police services. We cannot take police service taxes and fund non-police services from the City of Ottawa. And as I mentioned, the rate program, that's your water, wastewater, and storm. That program is fully funded from the user fees that we charge for those respective programs. Next slide. So some examples of tax-supported budgets. So again, these are funded from the property taxes we collect, which is roughly approximately 46% from the top property tax bill. These services cover things like our winter operations, pothole, road maintenance, all of our parks, recreations, paramedics, social services, fire services, etc. As I did mention earlier, some programs are funded differently from the province. Again, public health, paramedics, etc., do have different funding formulas that fund different components of the service. And again, those agreements are bound by that specific agreement, so we can't take funding from that program to fund other programs. Next slide. Transit services and Ottawa Police Services. Again, the transit services is funded through the transit tax levy portion of the property tax bill. We do have a fiscal framework that states that transit fares should recover 55% of the operating costs and 45% through the transit levy. Currently, that mix is roughly 60% levy and 40% fare revenue. We also have federal and provincial funding agreements in terms of funding the infrastructure. And again, this falls under the purview of the Transit Commission. From the police services perspective, this is governed by the Police Services Act. They have their own board, which is the Ottawa Police Services Board, and they direct the police service in terms of their budget, and that budget then rises to council for approval. Next slide. On the rate supported budget, again, this is your water, wastewater, and storm services. These are not funded through the property tax bill. They are actually funded through a separate bill. So you actually receive a bill, as you're aware, your water bill, wastewater bill, in terms of the amount of service that you use. Some of these programs obviously covers our drinking water purification, our stormwater management system, water meter installation life cycle, Roleplex sanitation center, etc. Next slide, please. So user fees and charges. So the Municipal Act does allow municipalities to impose fees and charges to cover the cost of delivering the service. These revenues are basically charged to cover the cost of providing that service as residents choose to use that service. There are various different fees and charges. Some of the examples that I did mention earlier were our transit fares would be considered a user fee, building permits, parking permits, your garbage fee, arena rentals, recreational programs, swimming lessons, etc. Next slide. So the next section I'll move in terms of the actual process from the budget development, as I'll speak to the budget directions report, the engagement, tabling, and adoption, give an overview of the committee structure and budget books in terms of what city service falls into each committee preview. I'll speak to some of the enhancements that you're going to see through this budget cycle and talk about determined council priorities and then the overall budget schedule moving forward. Next slide. So basically the budget process for 2024 kicked off immediately following the approval of the 2023 budget. This is a very hectic year in terms of the first year of a new term of council. We do 2 budgets in 1 year. So as Councillor Johnson alluded to, 9 months ago, we were having a similar discussion. So we're in the second budget of one fiscal calendar year. The directions report went forward in September and approved by council. That then sets the framework for the city, the finance team, to work with all departments to kind of build the budget, which you'll see tabled on November 8th. We are doing much more extensive public engagement this cycle around. We're doing engagement earlier, more often and more frequent. We will be tabling the budget on November 8th, with committee budgets being presented throughout the month of November, and then final adoption day on December 6th. Next slide. So as Councillor Cavanaugh did mention, the directions approved by council is to table a budget with a tax levy of no more than 2.5%. And that levy is to be applied to the same guidelines for the city tax levy, the transit tax levy, and the Ottawa Police Services tax levy. The overall rate program is driven by the rate long-range financial plan, which states that the overall rate program would increase at 4.3% for 2024. We also look at increasing our user fees across the services that we provide to reflect the cost of increasing services. And we always look for other ideas or any other opportunities that we may have in terms of additional revenues or generating ideas to kind of support the additional costs incurred. And this was adopted and approved at Council on September 13th. Next slide. So public engagement. So the engagement into the budget can be done year round, as the councillors did allude to, that discussions with your respective ward councillor is open all year round in terms of budget input. We do extensive online engagement and publicity when it comes to this time of year where we kick off the budget in September timeframe. There are a number of council-led consultations started last week in various areas. We are promoting the budget much more this cycle through various social media channels, recreational facilities, billboards, etc. And there's also some variety of electronic advertisements and promotional videos as well that we're trying to leverage. Next slide. So the budget will be tabled just under 2 weeks, or just over 2 weeks, I guess, from today on November 8th. We tabled a budget. Following the budget into the following week, we start the committee reviews. Each respective budget goes to the respective committee, and then that committee either recommends or that respective budget to the council with final adoption on December 6th. Next slide. So this slide basically shows at the bottom quadrant, what you'll see is all the city services that we offer, broken down by main area. And it shows what respective committee that service goes to. So if you look at the far right on the Transportation Committee, that's where you'll see the Traffic and Roads budget would fall into, versus the Transit Commission. Obviously, that's the OC Transit and Paratransit, and the Stage 2 operations. Again, this is where you would have the opportunity to come out and speak or delegate at that respective committee if that budget or topic that you would like to speak to falls within that respective city service. Next slide. So in 2024, there are a number of enhancements and new products. Immediately following the 2023 budget cycle, we did meet individually with each councillor. We also did a resident outreach survey as well. And from some of the feedback that we received through those forums, we are moving towards improving overall budget literacy, transparency, and making the budget more user-friendly. On tabling day, you will see a number of new products. One new product will be an online version of the budget. So currently the budget is between 12 to 1400 pages. It's a thick binder. That tool, all that data will be migrated to an online version. We will still have the hard copy versions available in our public libraries and service centers, but we'll also have that tool available online. We will release the link on tabling day. It will be on ottawa.ca. It's a very user-friendly, intuitive type navigation tool to be easier to navigate through the budget details. We're also releasing a new product as well to release additional level of detail in terms of different components of the budget, different metrics. We're using some KPI performance indicators as well, demonstrating, as an example, from a winter operations perspective, we have over 12,000 lane kilometers in the city that we are responsible to clear. So we're identifying various metrics for different service areas. The overall goal was to make things more simpler, more easier digestible, more relevant to the end user. Earlier, a few weeks ago, we did do a budget 101 session, a technical briefing as well, meeting with the media as well to kind of help them understand the budget a little better as well. Next slide, please. Not only did we do 2 budgets this year, but we also did term of council priorities this year. So it's been a very busy cycle. So we're trying to integrate the term of council priorities into the budget process as well. This is not something that hasn't been really done before. So again, that's another new enhancement that we're doing in this cycle. We will be further enhancing that for the next cycle, but we are enhancing and linking the term of council priorities to various components of the budget and various investments, which you'll see clearly throughout the budget documents and the committee presentations as we move through the budget process. Next slide. And as you can see, starting November 6th, the Ottawa Board of Health and the Public Library Board, they do table their respective budgets a couple of days before the city tables its budget. November 8th is when we table the remaining city services, and Ottawa Police Services Board tables their budget. From there, we move into the various committee reviews throughout the month of November, and then finally council adoption on December 6th. And that ends the presentation component.
All right. Thank you very much, Cyril. That is a busy looking November, December, but it's a lot to do. It's a lot to accomplish. So we've got some questions beginning to come in, which is helpful. This is, after all, a forum for you to ask those questions and have your questions answered, both hopefully, if possible, by Cyril about the process itself or some things that you have questions about within the process. And of course, by your counselors in terms of priorities, things they're focusing on, addressing your various concerns, that sort of thing. As I said off the top, what I'm going to do, obviously, is we are going to work our way through the questions as best we can. In some cases, we'll be consolidating questions that are similar. We're going to try and cover all the bases that do come in, though. So please exercise patience. We will eventually get to your question or some form of it. If you feel it hasn't been answered, there's nothing wrong with flagging that in the Q&A and letting us know again. But as I said, please do exercise a little bit of patience. We will likely get there if we haven't got there just yet. All right, well, let's start it off with I think what might be considered one of the elephants in the room. It's been mentioned a couple of times by counselors, particularly in the opening to this session. We have a resident who is curious, wondering about the rationale for the proposed 2.5% increase, particularly when inflation has been so much higher over the last year. They're expressing some concern about that. Would any of the three counselors like to address that question? Councillor Kavanagh.
Thanks, Tim. Yes, I share the concern. I think that we are going to see rising costs. We're seeing that just in our own budgets, rising costs of food, rising costs of rent. It's happening everywhere. Negotiations with unions, the rate, it's going more than 2.5%. So yes, there is a concern about that, and which is why I didn't support that that limit, because I think it's going to bind us, and it's going to mean something's not going to get done. That was my concern. So I'll pass it on to my colleagues if they want to comment.
Sure. Hello, everybody. So yeah, I mean, I share the same concern. I worry that a budget that, and just so people know, the 2.5% figure is not necessarily a figure that staff came to us and said, here's the ideal figure we want to raise the budget at. I think everyone knows that the 2.5% figure was a campaign promise that the mayor made, and I don't begrudge him trying to live up to a promise. It's not the way that I would have preferred to have budgeted. What I would have preferred is if every department could have, even within a spirit of knowing that there are limits to what we can do, I would have preferred if every department could have put forward a budget that reflects their needs, and we, as the elected body, could have gone through a process of, debating those budgets based on what we believe to be the priorities. The system we have in place now is everyone presents a budget with a 2.5% limit, which they all know is not enough to meet their needs. So I share the fear. I'm hopeful that in future years, we may see a budget direction that will hopefully reflect where this year's budget may lead us. I know that the 2.5% increase in property tax is not the only new revenue. Our chief financial officer will likely refer to the fact that there's other revenues that come from growth. There's always concerns about whether the new revenues that come from growth are possibly offset by some of the new expenses that come from growth. But that's where we are. To answer the question, it's likely a political decision that got us to the 2.5%. But I'll be charitable and understand that political decision reflects the fact that things are tight for everyone, including taxpayers. Not the way I would have done it, but that's where we are.
All right. Yeah, you're good? Okay. We have a related question, and so maybe I can go to that because it serves as a decent follow-on to the first question. It's the city budget purpose. The city budget's purpose, it says, is to provide common services to people: water, sewage, roads, etc. So, since salaries and material costs are the main drivers for rising budgets, but most budgets are very similar to past years, held to 2.5%, what are we cutting or deferring to hold this fiscal line, and what effect will this have on city services in the future? So maybe there's a couple of angles to come at this. There's the councillors obviously can answer that from a political perspective, but perhaps there's a technical answer to this, Cyril, in terms of understanding the impact of a 2.5% hold the line budget. Would you like to start with that?
Sure, I'll go from the technical side of the equation. So the 2.5%, as Councillor Devine said, that is one component. 50%, 53% of our revenue comes from property taxation. If you look at the rate structure, so the rate program, those fees are going up overall average of 4.3%. So that's increasing more than 2.5%. We also have user fees, so user fees go up in addition to that. The other component is as well, about 48% of our budget is allocated to staff costs. We are a unionized environment, governed by, I think, just about 13 collective agreements. Currently, for going into 2024, most have settled contracts in place for 2024. There's a couple not negotiated yet, but most are settled, and they have settled at that 2% mark. So they were settled prior, a couple of years ago. So there's a benefit there as well that, the biggest component of our budget is increasing at a rate of 2% or less. When we look at some other components of our budget, like fuel as an example, we do leverage edging contracts. So we go out to the market and we buy fuel at a set price. So we do get discounted fuel. From a diesel perspective, we are forecasting diesel to be at $1.48. If you go to your pump tonight, I would suspect you'll see diesel at about $1.80, $1.79. So again, we do leverage edging contracts. We do have over 20 fueling tanks across our yards where we have our own fuel. So there's a variety of different things that we leverage internally to kind of be more cost restraint and cost contain. In this budget, you will also see, like you saw in the 2023 budget, where council endorsed a service review framework. So there will be a number of items brought forward where we found further efficiencies. In the 2023 budget, there was over $50 million worth of savings flow through the budget. You'll see more savings come through this budget cycle as well once we table through that service review. We also look at things in terms of what we deem continuous improvements. And I'll speak to this one during the budget cycle, but I have no issue speaking to it today. Earlier this year, council approved the standing up of a data processing center at the City of Ottawa. So right now, all the automated speed enforcement tickets go to the City of Toronto. They're processed in there, then they're mailed out from in there. Council has approved that we would take that over ourselves. So we are internally going to be staffing up a team to do all the ticket processing. When that requirement came forward, there was a need for new space. We needed to go rent a new facility, which would have cost about $1 million per year to lease. So what we did in my department, because of the hybrid work environment, I vacated one of the floors at Consultation, so that team could go in and take that space over. And I'm accommodating that space through, most of my staff work 2 to 3 days a week in the office. So by leveraging other existing floor space allocated to my team, I'm able to fit my footprint in a smaller footprint and then use that space for another purpose as opposed to taking on additional facilities. So those are just a couple of examples of how, we manage within a 2.5% confine, because we do other things as well to kind of keep our costs down and be more innovative and financially prudent.
Okay, great. That was a good fulsome answer. Councillor Johnson, you had something to say on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of I appreciate Cyril absolutely going first, and Mr. Rogers really puts himself out here, with a lot of answers. But I think it is always important to remember that staff executes on the direction of council. And so, we can look at staff to say, why haven't you, proposed X, Y, Z savings here, blah, blah, but in fact, the feedback has to come to your counselor and it has to come to your mayor. And so, I do appreciate that the motion on the floor to do the service review has found some efficiencies. I'm glad to hear it. But I think there's also what impacts are being felt in our neighborhoods that come from some of these squeezes are things like regular park maintenance. So when you're saying, for example, like, did you know that the public works team, so the guys that cut your grass, that sweep your streets, that get rid of your snow, it's all the same team. And so they often operate within operating dollars, and they're going to have a budget pressure coming up in the next couple of years because of climate change. Well, if we don't get to have a different kind of conversation about our revenues, the adaptations that we need within that team for either growing the team so you can have more people out on the streets clearing snow, or the fact that, they have to be pulled away from your street sweeping because they're going and clearing debris in Constance Bay, which is something that we saw this year with the flooding. Like, they're the same guys. They when you're saying, oh my gosh, the grass is so long and there's ticks here, that's the same team. A lot of those costs are within operating dollars. So there are pressures, like there are efficiencies being created all the time. And that is because of the hard work of staff to be able to sort of uncover it. But a changing environment on our city creates new pressures. So it has to always be responsive with the current context. And I think that the challenge is that we lag now when we don't make hard decisions about how we get our revenues or what we cut, because that was what we wanted to hear. I hear from residents often, why can't you expand the park program for the pilot program in parks for waste diversion? Why does this park get to do recycling and green bins and this park does not? That program will not expand. Like, it won't until we have the money. So are there cuts or are there stretches? And I think that that's what's happening with the city is we're doing a lot of stretches, and that's because of council decisions. And if we want to make some actual difficult decisions, then you might see cuts in places that you're not comfortable with, because we're going to expand spending somewhere else. I don't think we do this at all. I don't think we do it at all. And we do balanced everything. And that is good because you don't piss anybody off and you make sure that everybody gets a little bit. And politically, that's really palatable. But you see an erosion or an inability to be innovative that I think is really frustrating for residents. So that I just wanted to put that there.
Okay, do either the other councillors wish to comment on the 2.5% issue? No.
I do want a better understanding of what fiscal measure this would be, but I don't want to comment. I'm not going to follow that. I just want to know what that move means. But
okay, thank you very much for that. All right, moving on to a couple of related questions. Luckily, we've got some good diversity of representation in the audience because we've got two competing questions that will let us get at what many consider to be a critical issue. So I'm going to represent both sides of this coin and ask the councillors to comment on it. On the one hand, we've got a participant saying, look, Ottawa's contribution to global climate change is minimal. Why are we putting so much focus on that? Why are we spending public tax dollars on climate mitigation strategies at the local level? On the other hand, we have another resident who is saying, we've got two declared emergencies in the city, a climate emergency and the housing emergency. And yet we're putting so much money into things like new road construction, which in this resident's view is a want, not a need in their view. Can we talk about that a little bit? Can we talk about where climate action fits into this? Is it a priority? There's been a declared emergency. Is that something that factors into the budget consideration for councillors? Anyone want to grab that one by the horns?
Sure, I'll jump in. I know that, so I was at, I really am trying to look at the question of how we spend to address the costs of climate change. I'm really trying to look at it as pragmatically as I can, and I'm trying to remove as much politics and ideology from the question and from the conversation as I can. When I was at that recent Federation of Canadian Municipalities conference, I was really, really motivated by what seemed to be a common concern about how the changes that we are seeing in weather events and their impacts on our city are costing us more and more and more in many ways, and in one example, in how our infrastructure is overloaded. And so I only have to look back, and I can look back at many, many weather events in my ward alone over the last 5 years. But I only have to look back to the historic rain that we had on August 10th, in which the city had far too vast amounts of rainwater fall into our stormwater system in 90 minutes, completely overwhelming our system. Whether that event was an anomaly or not, whether or not we can predict that that event will repeat in the not too distant future or not, it happened, and many events like that are happening. And so my concern is, how can I invest in new and better infrastructure to handle that? For example, the city of Montreal is looking at what can they do to make their cities more absorbent. So if we're only talking about water as an example, what can they do to turn their cities into the term that is being used now, sponge city? So that cities where most of the people are going, how can these cities be absorbent of water? And so when I look at the contrast between, if I have to choose between spending money on new park infrastructure so that we can have more absorbent green spaces, or bigger stormwater pipes so that more water can flow through them. If I'm choosing between investing in those costs, or on the flip side, investing in road widening projects, which not only will create more non-permeable surfaces, but which will introduce the passage for more and more vehicles into our city. For me, it's a no-brainer. If I'm thinking about long-term safety and viability of my city, I err on that side. And I make those kinds of decisions with not a shred of ideology behind it. It's just, for me, a very pragmatic and practical response to what I see as a growing concern.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Devine. Councillor Kavanagh, you looked like you were making a motion at the beginning of this.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Climate change is important, and the climate change emergency and the housing emergency. We declared those, and we have to act like we mean it. Particularly the housing emergency, it has to be a big focus, and a big part of that, in particular, is getting money from other levels of government. We need their help. We've got to do it more quickly, and there's certainly pressure from the province to do that, but they don't tend to talk about affordable housing. They talk about housing in general. So, but we need that affordability. It's crucial when you just look at the waiting list. 12,000 right now for those waiting for affordable housing. Climate emergency. It's so multifaceted, and we have been successful at putting a climate lens on our departments, and I know Cyril has worked on that. This is important, but it's hard to show, and it's not moving very fast because, frankly, it requires a lot of money to move forward, but it will save us money. For example, doing retrofitting of buildings, etc. Those are things that will, in the long term, save us money, but it's about having that upfront capital to get those things done. There's lots of things out there that we need to be working on, and road widening. Well, It tends to be, let's be honest, the outer areas that cry for that more are urban areas that are within the greenbelt and not to be crying out for those as much. In fact, I get mostly asked about cycling infrastructure and better sidewalks so we can get around, and traffic calming to slow people down. So not road widening. So, but we have to recognize that's the kind of thing you see in different wards that gets asked for, but we still have to think in terms of what's best for all of us.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Kavanagh. Councillor Johnson.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that the road widenings project is a really good example of what Cyril was describing when, like, the funding is locked. A lot of road widening projects are funded through development charges related to growth in those areas. And so we don't really have the option of taking that cash from road widening and putting it into housing, for example, even though that feels like something we'd really like to do. The development charge bylaw has categories of development charges. So at best, it would be able to be applied to a different road project. And it would have to be related to the growth, like the developer input or investment in that area. So it's not perfect. But one thing that I have done in the last year, and you know, I don't know if you guys know that bureaucracy is slow, but it is. And sometimes that works to your advantage. We have this road widening project coming up in the next budget that is out in Canada. And it's been, I think, in the works for about 30 years. It's related to the Canada Centrum mall, and it's this underpass. And because it's been sort of kicked down the line for so long, it was actually able to be reevaluated with the current TMP policies in mind. So they've added some cycling infrastructure, they've added some other pieces. But in fact, we asked them, there was a few of us that was, and pardon me, Councillor Devine was on some of those calls as well, to sort of say, you know, would this even go through now under the new TMP? Would because they have a different sort of casting of priority. Would this project truly even go through? So we've stalled that project again, which is probably frustrating because we don't want to be in the business of stalling projects, but luckily this moves so slowly that this particular road widening might end up being redistributed to newer road projects that are necessary for growth. Because one would imagine that if you didn't build it in the last 30 years and there's so much growth happening in Canada anyway, yeah, you promised the thing at the time, but like, is it really necessary to serve those communities? That's what we're investigating now. Not to say it won't happen, but to say that we might be able to distribute it to other places in Canada that do require that service of road. So we may see that happen.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Johnson. All right. We can move on to another question. We've, as you might expect, given the things that have been in the news over the last few years in Ottawa, there's a fair amount of concern about large capital projects. And so we have a couple of questions in the Q&A about that. One sums it up fairly nicely in that this individual is concerned, they say, that taking out debt to fund capital projects, many of them are projects that are simply deferred maintenance in their view, taking out debt to fund capital projects goes against, in their view, the spirit of having a balanced budget indicated by the Municipal Act. What they really want to know, though, is what percentage of the city's budget is currently forecasted for 2024 to be allocated to pay interest on outstanding debt. Is that something that we can readily answer for them?
Yeah, I can answer that. So I'll give you a little bit of a breakdown first. So the Municipal Act does state that municipalities in Ontario are required to maintain a debt service ratio of 25% of own source revenues. So what that means is of all the taxation dollars that a municipality collects, the maximum amount of debt that they can have is 25% of that. The City of Ottawa has further restricted that down to 7.5%. So the province sets a 25% threshold, the City of Ottawa sets a 7.5%. So we're being really fiscally prudent. In the 2023 budget, our debt service ratio was around 5%. That's typically where we kind of float, is in that 5% level. Final numbers aren't compiled yet. That's what we're doing in the next 5-6 days, is finalizing all the numbers for 2024. But typically we are around that 5% plus or minus a couple decimal points. So again, that illustrates that we're really fiscally prudent in terms of our debt load. And we do basically, we service that through tax collection. And again, it's similar to your mortgage on your house. So if we're going to go and invest into a new road or a new road resurfacing, that road typically would last 20 years. If we build a new building, typically buildings last 30 years. So by taking out a 30-year mortgage, I pay for that for the next 30 years, as do any new incomers, in terms of help supporting that over the 30 year, because I'm going to benefit from that from now for the next 30 years. So we kind of amortize it over that level. So a little bit technical, but I think it's important to distinguish between the 25 to 7.5 and where we fall.
All right. Thank you, Cyril. Councillor Johnson.
Sorry, just a couple follow-up questions for Cyril. So what is our current credit rating? If we are at that really low threshold, we must have a fabulous credit rating.
We typically we're in that AAA to AA. I mean, every year we go through a rating program with 3 or 4 of the main raters out there in the marketplace, and we've been historically in that AAA, AA position, which is really good, which makes our bonds and our issues very attractive when we do go to market.
And what would happen? What would need to happen for us to get a poorer rating?
So they look at the entire ecosystem of us as an organization. They also look at the economics as well. So they look at, obviously the wars overseas in the Middle East is not favorable to economic conditions, but they look at the micro and macroeconomics of everything. We just finished one earlier this year, back in June, July timeframe, and we were able to maintain, I think that one was a AA rating. So again, they look at everything. They look at our reserve balances. Coming through the pandemic, we were one of the few municipalities where we did not lay off any staff. We do have, our reserves are in a good position right now. We've been pretty fiscally responsible in terms of managing our reserves. So again, they look at all those conditions as well, and equally looking at how we perform throughout the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic.
All right. Satisfactory answer, clearly. All right. That's great. Thank you very much. We've got a one-off for Councillor Johnson, so be ready on your button. Question for Councillor Johnson. I'm a resident of Garfield Avenue. Are there any funds allocated in the capital budget to restore recreation amenities and parks for children in the northeast side of Bel Air community? And then they list several examples: Garfield Avenue, East End of Bel Air, et cetera, et cetera. So they're concerned about things like recreation, budgets for recreation purposes.
Thank you. And I did kind of sneak a peek at the Q&A boxes, so I know that this person is in my ward, and I know that I am outstanding in returning your call. So thank you for finding me and asking the question here, Steve. And I do apologize for that. So I know you've been speaking with Chelsea in my office about this pressure, and I do also live in Bel Air, so I have that. I have the knowledge of the area. So what I have done is connected with, so currently Putnam is under Ottawa Public Health rental. And so they have that space right now. So I did meet with Vera Etches today, and I asked her to give me an update on what that facility could do, or what the evolution of that facility might look like over time as it becomes, whether it will evolve from its medical purposes, and whether we might have an opportunity to recover some of the spaces that way. Park renewal is usually a pretty, like when I was talking about stretches, you could see that maybe there are some stretches in some of our parks. They are on a life cycle, so they do have to be replaced for safety reasons, but certainly that life cycle can be nudged for various pressures as well. So at this time, the closest parks to us are like I literally live on the other side of the NCC space, just so you know. Like I share your, so it's Agincourt Park, which is the renewal, and it's going to be renewed in they've just started demolition today. So they're going to be renewing it for next year. And then I've checked for Green Lawn. Green Lawn doesn't have any renewal coming up in the next little while, but we're going to have conversations about whether we can put money into it from our own cash in lieu. So there are some questions outstanding, and I appreciate that you're seeking more recreational amenities. I think some of the challenges with College Ward, I know I'm taking up too much space, but like with all of our outer urban wards, so I'll make it about all of us. We are in a demographic shift whereby, you know, we have had sort of older families for a longer time, certainly College Ward, and now we've had many young people move in to start families, and there's a gap in what's available to these young families and sort of the population critical mass that you need in order to serve them. So we don't have the benefit of, you know, Sean Devine's Sportsplex, for example, but even the demand on those programs, you know, a lot of people will go to the Sportsplex for various programs. It's a changing demographic pressure, I think, as well in some of our neighborhoods.
Thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. We're about an hour into this meeting, so for those of you who may have joined us partway through, tonight's discussion is being handled through the Q&A function in the meeting. So if you wish to ask a question of any of your councillors or of the Chief Financial Officer of the city, Cyril Rogers, you can place that question into the Q&A, and we will do our best to moderate those questions and bring them to the panel. If for whatever reason you're unable to place a question in the Q&A, if you happen to have phoned in tonight or something like that, you are always welcome, of course, to send questions to your respective councillor's office, and we can deal with them that way, offline. All right. Okay, so thank you very much. We're going to move on. There have been a few inquiries tonight related, of course, to capital expenditures. And a few of them have talked about the relationship between large projects like Lansdowne, LRT, that sort of thing, and the relationship to housing. Because obviously housing is a major concern in the Canadian political landscape right now. Ottawa is no exception to that. And we have one person in particular asking, why is it that a larger amount of capital expenditures can't be targeted towards making housing more affordable in the city of Ottawa? Is there any way to rebalance that equation? Is there any way to place more emphasis on ensuring that we have affordable homes for the people who need them most? Does anybody wish to talk to that? We can approach this question obviously on a couple of levels about the relationship between things like funding for affordable housing and large capital projects, or you can tackle it any way you like.
So I'll jump in just as an FYI, I guess. So during the 2023 budget process, I did commit to coming back with a refresh housing long-range management plan. We did table the city tabled its first long-range management plan for housing in 2021. But given the volatility in the market and the changing conditions, just not even quite 2 years into that plan need to be refreshed. So that's what I committed to. And we will be bringing that forward as part of the budget documentation and budget report. So you'll see a new report there. One thing I will highlight as well, and the councillors are fully aware of this, recently, a few months back, the province did hand out some significant funding to the City of Toronto. We received around 700,000. City of Toronto received well over 40 million as a kind of a one-time contribution to them. So again, it just goes to illustrate some of the inequities that we have in what I refer to the system from the federal, the province, and down to the municipal level. It is something that we do work closely with the mayor's office and city manager's office in terms of, I guess, fighting or advocating for our fair share, because it is a federal, provincial, and municipal issue that we need to solve collectively.
Okay, thank you, Cyril. Does anybody else wish to comment on affordable housing?
Yeah, I'll jump in from a bit of a political lens, I suppose. So to answer the question, why aren't we, or why can't we do more about housing, for example? So going back to the conversation we had earlier, where in our current budgeting format, we have applied a set rate of taxation increase, and that limits how much we can do. And so to a certain extent, when the question is, why can't you spend more on housing? Well, we can if we go about our budgeting process differently. Where if we allow rather than setting a rate on the budget, if we allow the various committees to state their needs, then the committee that has oversight over the housing budget would likely present a budget that was more ambitious. And then we as a council could debate whether or not to favor that budget or to favor, for example, the road widening budget. So to a certain extent, our process limits us. So there can be changes there. That said, even within that framework, even within the framework we have, if theoretically, like the overall budget envelope for the Planning and Housing Committee can increase by 2.5%, and I'm not part of that committee, so I don't draft that budget, but perhaps they within that committee will have to make some tough decisions on how to expand that 2.5%. That won't give them much wiggle room. But the other answer to the question of how can we perhaps do more to spend money on housing, that might come down to another level of political pressure that might come from our residents. So just for example, right now, like many cities across the country, Ottawa is waiting to hear the results from the application we made to the federal government for funds under the Housing Accelerator Fund. So we are waiting to hear whether or not we are going to be the recipient of, I believe, $150 million in funding that goes towards housing. We don't yet know whether or not conditions will be imposed upon the City of Ottawa because perhaps in our application, we weren't bold enough. Let's say that happens. This has been happening across the country, where cities have been told by the Minister of Housing, listen, your application is on hold until you go further in your application. So what may be coming down the pipe for us soon, we don't know. We may get the money, which is fantastic, or we may get pressure from the minister to do more than we did in our application. For example, they may say, we want the City of Ottawa to approve 4 units as of right across the city. And when we, as a council, as a council, are faced with that decision, then we will be looking to our communities who are all saying, we want more housing, we want more housing. And we will be looking to our communities to ask if our communities are willing to accept the changes that might come with some of that essential money for housing. So long, windy answer to your question, but oftentimes the answer to that question of why isn't there more money for housing comes down to political will. That's it. Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you, Councillor Devine. Any more comments on that? No, we're good. All right. We do have a question about the effects of intensification, changes to the official plan, Bill 23, all of those sorts of things all rolled up into one. But essentially what it boils down to is the effects of intensification and the impact on infrastructure in the city. How does the city pay for that? When an old aging infrastructure in an inner city neighborhood needs to take on the task of dealing with new intensification projects in that area, how does the city pay for that? Through a special levy, through property taxes? How is that covered?
Ooh, can I answer that one?
Absolutely. It's your show, Councillor.
Well, it's a good question, and it's one that comes up. And every time developments are put forward, that's one of the checklists that they have to go through. Do we have enough water supply? Do we have enough infrastructure? How does it all get there? Those are factors that have to be done when you're doing infill. Now, it should be noted, the same process has to go when you're building further out. And that costs more, a lot more. So far cheaper to hook up to a system that pre-exists and yes, there is capacity, versus keep extending. You're still, you're adding to the city, you're adding more people to the city, and you have to build new roads, new sidewalks, new parks, further and further out. So that is very costly. Think of the difference when there's already pre-existing roads and sidewalks, and yes, they need to be hooked up with the water, etc. And development charges are for those things. That is what we charge as a city. So just a reminder that it is a checklist. It's part of what they look at when those buildings go up.
Great. Thank you, Councillor. Anything else to add, anyone? Councillor Johnson?
Yeah, well, just to again sort of go back to what you can expect to weigh in on in the next little while, because I think that's always really important, and certainly something we talked about with the Cyril's department is that, the plans are where the policy decisions are made, and then the budget is the output from those plans. So once you see the numbers in the budget, it's based on a set of policies that were established earlier. So we really want to make sure that we're encouraging as many people as possible to get hip to the plans, and when the plans come to committee and council for decision. So one that's coming towards the end of the month is the infrastructure master plan, which deals a lot about water. And there's 2 proposed increases or improvements to our wards in there. There's the Maryvale sewer improvement to try and support City View and the surrounding areas for the intensification that is proposed there. There's also a Pinecrest one that would be coming to support the north side of the Queensway as well. And so within that, there's also the request for 2 new full-time employees in water services to proactively identify weak or vulnerable areas of infrastructure related to water in anticipation of the intensification to come. So some of those pieces will be really important for what you're describing. And certainly I believe that the council and committee will support those investments for those reasons. But it cannot be understated. Our wards, Ward 8, Ward 7, Ward 9, Alta Vista, perhaps, some of the other sort of we will feel the greatest shock when it comes to growing our city. We will have the greatest transformation. Suburbs like Barrhaven and Canada, they've had the zoning in place already. They will see some increases, but really the difference is going to be for our R1 communities and for our transit corridors and our minor corridors in our neighborhoods that are going to see the greatest transformation. And so we really want to hear from residents when it comes to those plans, and not just as budget. But we need to shift the conversation about what opportunities can come through growth and investment, because there is so much lacking. When you're talking about the parks that you want closer to your house, when you're talking about, the coffee shop you want to go to, the walkability, the road safety, the pedestrian crossings, all of those can be funded through development. Not exclusively, but like a lot of it comes through change and growth. And so I'm welcoming, a conversation about what we want from these changes, not what we're afraid of. We know what we're afraid of. Change is what we're afraid of. Loss of identity. But we could harness this if we would enter into that kind of conversation. So there will be many plans in the next little while that give that opportunity. And I just can't wait to hear from you. From all of you, and from those who we perhaps hear from even less in these kinds of spaces and invitations, about what opportunities we can really manage in these wards. So I just wanted to offer that.
Great, thank you very much, Councillor. Anything from anyone else on this one? We're back to another technical question for you. I believe it's probably going to be Cyril that'll need to answer this, but it's good to help educate people on why the budget works the way it does. It's a question about road maintenance. The question is that when we build a road, obviously we know that the road is going to need maintenance down the road. Why is it that repaving of a road is considered a capital expense rather than an operating expense?
Because once we repave that road, typically we get a 20-year life out of that road. So once the new road is up for resurfacing, that should last for 20 years is the objective. So it's more than 1 year. The pothole program, that will be operating budget because we fill the pothole in. If we're lucky, we get 1 season out of the pothole. If we're not so lucky, we fill the pothole 3 or 4 times in a season, and then that's why it's operating.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm sure somebody's walked away a little happier tonight. I learned something too. All right, and we have another somewhat technical question about the movement of money across the budgets. You referenced at the beginning of your presentation tonight, Cyril, about how some budgets need to remain fixed, that there's some walls between different pockets of the budget. But there's a question about why money can't be moved from the police budget to other things, particularly when it seems like historically there might be precedent for that. For example, when some councillors in previous councils withheld money from a police budget, $3 million in this example, from an annual police budget increase, but the city chose to put it toward youth mental health services instead. So could you elaborate a little bit more on that and talk about the relationship among different budgets and why it is why you might not be able to move things around so easily?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, because yes, the dollar that comes in from the police tax levy supports the police service. Then the council put, like in this example, the council put forward the Ottawa Police Services build the budget at 2.5%. If they choose to come back at 2%, then effectively we're not going to tax at 2.5, we're going to tax at 2%. So there's a little nuance there where there could be a motion put forward where we reduce the amount of budget that they're allocated, and at which point we wouldn't tax as much for it. So that's the little bit of a nuance where I think it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago, there was a motion put forward where the police services budget came in at 2% versus city services came in at 3%, and that was the direction for police services to also come at 3%. So if there is a reduction, we change that as per the motion approved by council, then their effective tax rate would go down. So we wouldn't tax at 3, we would tax at 2, and that incremental would come over. So it's a little bit of a technical nuance there, but council does that at the will of council, and if the Ottawa Police Services Board accepts that, then that would come back and their tax rate would come down, and we would move that funding over and bridge it on the city side.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Great answer. Clear. Another question about moving money around, but this one's a little bit more of a political question than a technical one. It's a question about priorities to deal with the relationship between things like investing in active and public transportation, recycling education, electrification, greenhouse gas reductions, versus spending money on things like roads, traffic signals, car parking garages, and sprawl. The resident is asking, why don't we put more emphasis on the reduction strategies rather than the intensive infrastructure projects? It's a political question. Does anyone want to tackle that? Councillor Kavanaugh.
Thank you. Well, those are priorities that you've just listed that I want. So I'm putting them forward. It's going to be 24 different sets of priorities sometimes across the city. And let's face it, there's different priorities in different areas. But I will continue to press for those things that you've just outlined, and I believe my colleagues are too. But not everyone is, because they think their residents are not interested in those things, and they have their priorities are the ones, some of the concerns that you have. So it's the way we vote, and our votes show what we are concerned about, and we're going to keep pushing. We know we have X number of dollars. Even if I get everything I want, I know it's still going to take time because we don't have it all at once, but we have to keep pushing forward. And I thank you for raising the question, because you know, that's the difference between different viewpoints.
Councillor Johnson.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. Another topic I'm very passionate about. Parking is an interesting one because parking is a fee. And so parking is one of those things that it needs to be collected and then spent on the thing that you collect it for, I believe, under the act. And I didn't understand that. I thought, oh man, parking revenue, great. Guess what? We have to spend parking revenue from cars on other things that support ostensibly cars. So that's something that, you know, that team is being pushed to look at. So you'll see that there's a bike parking pilot that's being funded out of the parking services revenue. There's also an argument, I think, currently being made that we could use a bike sharing. We could do a bike sharing pilot out of the parking services revenue that had like, I don't want to see any steam coming out of Serial Zeros. I have no idea where that is, but I believe there's pushes to try and do that. But it is a frustration in that sense that, you know, we can only spend the money to recover the cost of what's associated with cars. I think our biggest opportunity about what you're describing is that driving sucks for everybody. We are reaching a point where congestion is a bane of like, who drove today? I did. My husband did. Like, it was miserable. We without the Queensway as a spine, with all the construction projects we have going on, with intensification and with a struggling transit, like, we are getting to the point where everybody knows that, well, everybody, to Teresa's point, it's not everybody, but we're getting closer to be able to make a solid argument that this is not working. And so we do need to have a bit of a shift. And I think that that's one of our greatest opportunities. Certainly, you know, the transition to the LRT stage 2 in the east. I know they're really looking forward to having some of those trains online because they experience a ton of congestion through the east. Again, because the east is zoned for a lot more density actually than the west for the most part. So we are in a place where we can start using the language of cars to support other investments. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. I think that the transportation master plan will point to a lot of it. Again, lots of points for consultation for the transportation master plan to inform what those investments look like, to inform what our mode share targets are, because they're going to be designing the whole city so that we know that people in the rural area, we want, 10% more people to take active or public transit, let's say. Well, I bet in our wards, theoretically, it's going to be a major shift. They're going to want all of us to get out of our cars. I think they should, because we're bottlenecking for those that drive around. When, ostensibly we're 10 minutes from downtown, right? So those mode share targets are another point for public consultation. And I know that the councillors and myself will be sharing those opportunities. So again, let's generate really good data to try and push those mode share targets in the direction that we want, that will push the investments to where we want to see. I think it's a very exciting time.
Thank you, Councillor. Anyone else on that one? Just to trace back on that for a second, because I know that there's a lot to absorb when we hear about the budget every year. There's a wide variety of questions coming through, and sometimes things get shorthanded or referenced. The reference to we're only allowed to spend parking money on parking related things. It's important to note that that's due to provincial laws and regulations. People who are listening in on this may wonder if that's just an arbitrary rule that Ottawa has set up for itself. No, it isn't. it's governed by provincial legislation. So that's an important thing to take note of. There are some municipalities who have spoken up and wish that parking revenues could be spent on other things. So there's an active effort there. So if that's something you want to support your city on, of course, you're always welcome to contact your local MPP and make the case. All right, we've got another question here about community associations. Wondering if there's going to be funds in this year's budget to help cover insurance for community associations. Councillor Devine, that's a specialty for you.
Well, yeah, but I'll defer to Lane because I think Lane is a little bit more up to speed on the conversation, or perhaps Teresa, because Teresa probably talks quite frequently with somebody who is up on the conversation. So very briefly, that is something that I believe all three of us share a concern with, where community associations, and I believe there are some people in the audience here tonight that lead community associations, are being charged more money than they should be expected to afford to put on the community programming that they do. There is a lot of support around council to try to mitigate that and to decrease that financial pressure on community associations who are doing so much of the community building work for our city. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Lane or Teresa, we are waiting to hear a report, November 7th, I think is the date I heard from our city solicitor, where they're going to be presenting some update on what level of, and maybe Cyril knows more about this, but what level of cost there may be on community associations for this insurance. So just to answer briefly, I think we're waiting for an update soon. And we share that concern. But Lane and Teresa, anything more on that?
I believe so, but we'll double check on that. I can ask one of my staff to check in. But the thing is about community associations that that need that insurance. They're the backbone of communities, and we want to keep them strong. This is cheap. We're not asking city staff to go out and flood the rinks. We're not asking city staff to be hired and do all this maintenance. We've got volunteers out in the community, and we've had it set up for a certain legacy number, but the city's growing. And frankly, I think it's the biggest bang for our buck that we could have, because it means more services out there, more rinks, more community get-togethers. The insurance piece should not be treated as something that is outrageously expensive. It's a bargain. It's a bargain because we've got all these people out there who are making our communities better for a very low fee. So I think we need to look at this seriously and treat it as something that helps develop a better city, that makes it more livable.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor. All right, we've got a plea in the comments for the city to authorize 4 units on lots instead of the 3 that went through council recently. But it starts with a plea, but then there's a question attached to it, which is how much is the city expecting to get from the HAF?
I hear the
From
number that
Housing Accelerator Fund. Yeah.
I think the number that I hear is that, and Cyril, maybe you know this, but I believe I've heard the figure that we are waiting to hear of is upwards of 150 million. That's what I heard.
Yeah, that was our application, 150 million.
And so we stand to gain that much. And I don't know if the feds look at an application and if they're not ultimately excited by the application, I believe they have the option of providing a lower amount. I think I've seen that happen to a few cities. Lane her eyebrows are telling me that I might not be right there. So I think that's the answer. We stand to gain 150 million.
Anything else to add, anyone? Councillor Kavanagh?
Yeah, we have to keep re-emphasizing that, yes, we need more housing, but don't forget about affordable housing. And we need specific money targeted for that affordable housing. Ottawa Community Housing is doing that right now. We're trying to build more and more. And yes, it helps to have more housing spread out, and that's with the 4 units. We're already been told 3 units. I mean, that's done. Everybody knows that. That came with the province under Bill 23. So I guess it's just upping the ante. I don't have a problem with it, but they've got to focus on that affordable housing, and that has to be targeted. So let's not forget about that, because we may still leave people behind. We've got a big equity gap.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Johnson?
Yeah, so I think I couldn't follow Teresa's comments better. I would like to put forward that I do believe that you know, zoning is one piece of it, but it's not the solution to the whole thing. And I think that my challenge with this idea of 3 as of right or 4 as of right, one, I do believe we do have some very tight infrastructure issues within our outer urban wards that will be seeing the greatest amount of intensity or change. And I do want to make sure that the residents of my ward are confident that the infrastructure in place can support this level of density. We have already, last week was transformative. We passed zoning for 3. And we've done it in a way that, you know, we believe can be sustainable and safe. And I think that that's actually quite an exciting moment. It can be up to 6 units on a lot for, you know, semi-detached. And like, I mean, you're going to see a lot of movement with this 3 units. So the 3 to 4, I appreciate the idea. I think that we will find at the end of the comprehensive zoning bylaw that we're going to be achieving a great deal because of what our official plan has already asked of the city of Ottawa. So I think that's part of the conversation right now. I don't want to be told that I am a NIMBY. What I am suggesting is similar to what Councillor Kavanagh has put forward, where we can zone and approve, and Councillor Kavanagh and I sit on planning and housing, and we have approved every single application since I was elected. We are approving everything. It is not a matter of offering zoning sometimes. It's not a matter of approving what's in front of us. It's a matter of economic starts for developers, which are currently not favorable with interest rates. It is not a good time to borrow. They are borrowing at about a 7% interest rate. They don't want to do it. They need other incentives. I appreciate that, but we also have our own financial pressures with public dollars. And so do we invest in envelopes or push other envelopes for that continuum of affordable housing? 4 units as of right on a lot does not guarantee affordability. It is a belief in a supply and demand, which is one part of the equation, certainly. But let's not lose sight of the more complex issues of deep affordable housing, portable housing subsidies, small landlords. There's a lot of places where we could do other things to support affordability. And I'm not sure, I just don't want to get too simple. And I don't mean to be like paternalistic either. I just, because I come from affordable housing as well, because I grew up in a co-op, I just want to make sure that we have the whole conversation in front of us and not just a zoning solution. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right, we've got a couple more questions here that I'm gonna, there's a theme that has been going on all night, and there's a couple of questions here that relate to it. Concern about infrastructure in some of the aging neighborhoods of the city, and the impact of climate, changes in the climate, increasing levels of rainfall, increasing heat, the stresses that puts on infrastructure. Perhaps the question is double-barreled. Is that a concern or a consideration for council, dealing with those sorts of potential infrastructure deficiencies given the demands being placed on that infrastructure? Councillor Devine illustrated one earlier with that incredible amount of rain we had back in early August that overwhelmed the system in some neighborhoods. Is that a consideration? Is that something that council and the city is turning its mind to, dealing with the potential deficit of infrastructure in aging neighborhoods? Does anybody want to try and tackle those?
Is that two questions in one? Because I know that earlier we were talking about
It is.
infrastructure deficit. I mean, Councillor Johnson was articulating the concern that all of our aging wards have when it comes to an infrastructure gap. What's the connection? Sorry, I may have missed the linkage between the questions about
No, it's
lack
more
of
just
infrastructure.
a category of people are expressing concerns about these things. You know, they're concerned about climate change. They're concerned about infrastructure. They're concerned about the ability of the infrastructure to keep up with it. But they're primarily, by the looks of it, concerned with that, particularly in neighborhoods that have been around for
Yeah.
50, 60, 70 years versus neighborhoods that are being built new. Is that part of the consideration?
Well, I mean, yeah. So I live similar to Lane and Teresa. I drive around, I mean, my own neighborhood, and I drive around many parts of my ward, and the sidewalks, roads just feel like they're crumbling. Ironically, so Mayor Sutcliffe is doing tours with different councillors in every ward of the city, and he was on a tour of parts of Barrhaven with Councillor David Hill and Councillor Wilson Lowe. And I saw a photo of the mayor with Wilson on a street, and they said that they were out there addressing some Barrhaven concerns. And they were talking about concerns with transportation and safety and renewing our crumbling infrastructure. And I said, in Barrhaven, geez, you're I think they have a different experience than we have here. So but to go back to what Lane was saying, this is why, and I applaud her and support her on this. This is why the conversation that we have around intensification and the development charges that come with intensification and the infrastructure that arises from those development charges, this is why we have to frame these conversations about what do we want to see and how can we see and embrace the benefits and the changes that come from this intensification, as opposed to only being concerned about the perfectly legitimate and understandable fears. I don't ever deny anyone when they express a fear of change. I think that is as human can be. And it just takes a little bit more optimism, confidence, trust in the system to see the possible benefits of that change. And so we in our aging wards, my predecessor, Keith Eglai, I don't think in his 12 years he had to deal with the amount of intensification that I'm looking at in my first year. And I'm sure things are similar in Lane's wards. And I mean, Teresa, you're not a first-term councillor, but we are seeing such a spike in development. And because of that change, I completely understand people's fear of it. But I hope that we can see this and steer the revenues towards how can we use this opportunity to rebuild our neighborhoods in a way that will properly support and sustain all of that growth, all of that diversity of new people coming into our neighborhoods, and make the neighborhoods better because of the diversity and better because of what we can do with that money. And my kids are trying to creep into my room here. So yeah, I completely support everyone's concern about how we can address these infrastructure gaps. And I think it's great that we have a bunch of suburban councillors that are speaking from the same chorus and pushing for that investment.
Right. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Kavanagh, it looks like you're reaching for your button.
Yes, thank you. I'll just say quickly, I think people are worried about losing green space when with infill. That's a big concern. And that's why we had to put in things like the tree bylaw and regulate and make sure that we have more green space, that we don't lose that. But it's a balancing act to have the intensification, but still have opportunities to have green space. I think that was one of the concerns. Maybe I was reading between the lines, but I think that was it. We're off topic of budget, I know, Cyril. But the planning creeps into everything. Yes, we're going to have lots of planning. Yeah. And how does that affect our budget? Well, it's more revenue because all those units pay taxes. So that's a good thing. So that's one aspect. And again, it's we actually do better when that intensification is happening rather than sprawl. We're using the same resources, but yes, we need parks still. We need to keep trees. We need that tree canopy. Those are all things that are important.
Right. Thank you, Councillor. I think everybody's families are beginning to creep in now. We're getting towards the end of the evening. I've got two more questions that I'm going to put out there, and I'm just going to remind everybody who stayed with us through this exercise this evening. Thank you for your time being here. You can, of course, always approach your councillors with questions. It does not just have to be through this forum. Sending emails anytime to let us know what you're concerned about and what you're thinking about is completely valid. So this is not your only chance to ask. So I'm going to grab one last question here that's, again, on a theme that has cropped up repeatedly tonight. I'm just going to read it verbatim. It's largely a political question, but it does speak to allocation. It does speak to funding. The question says, when will enough be enough? When will an overhaul happen in terms of affordable housing and the issues that mix with that? Homelessness is already bad. So where is the line where the city decides to make the necessary changes? How bad will the emergency state / crisis get before there's a collapse in our municipality where a change to the system is the only option? So I think this person is just expressing a common concern about the homelessness crisis and the affordability crisis. And I guess asking, is there enough emphasis here? Councillor Kavanagh.
Yeah.
Councillor Devine, then Councillor Kavanagh. Sorry about that.
I mean, I'll leave it to Councillor Kavanagh for the housing part. But on the question of, the breaking point, so I won't speak to the breaking point about the housing situation, but in terms of the breaking point, in terms of, because as we said earlier, we as a municipality, other municipalities across the country, municipalities across the world, are struggling more and more with how to pay for what we are mandated to do. It wasn't less than, I mean, it's an entirely different system, I'm sure, but less than a few months ago, I don't remember the name of the city in England, Birmingham, some city, declared bankruptcy. Cities will continue as cities become more and more constrained by what we can do, but the demand for what we have to do grows because populations are coming to cities. We will face very, very challenging discussions about if we see our purse emptying more and more, then there will be breaking points, and we will have fundamentally even more challenging conversations than we're having now. I don't necessarily look forward to having those questions because those questions will likely only be raised because of a great amount of pain that people are experiencing. But hopefully that would bring about a new way of seeing how we, as the residents of a city, can address and find common cause in what our needs are. I'll just leave it there for that and turn it back to housing. Teresa.
I almost forgot the question. Okay, homelessness. It's something that we thought of as a downtown problem, where we saw people sleeping on the streets. Well, guess what? It's come to other communities. We're seeing it. I'm sure you've seen it as well. We're seeing it in our parks, in all different places, and people are shocked. But it's the reality that like where do these people go? What can we do? Well, the truth is we don't have a lot of options. We have shelters that are at their limit, absolutely at their limit, and we also have waiting lists for affordable housing. So yeah, this is a priority. I know it every day. And listening this morning, as I mentioned before, I was listening to the community health centers who came with residents telling us about their issues. It's people who are still waiting on for affordable housing after 12 years in some cases. Yeah, it is a crisis, and we got to get going on it. But we do need those partnerships. We do need the province and the feds big time to help us. This is not something we can do on our own.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Kavanagh. Much appreciated. We have one last question that I've saved to the end because I think it's appropriate as a capper for the end. The budget itself is going to be tabled in the next few weeks. I believe, Cyril, you said November 8th is the tabling date. Yes. So the question here is that once it's been tabled, how can the public participate? What are the options for input? What routes do people have to provide commentary and provide input on the budget?
I mean, obviously, Councillor Ward's obviously a councillor, respective councillor is one avenue, but the one of the second last, third last slide that I showed, and the second last slide shows all the committee dates. So those are where residents can come out and have a public delegation. So the committee schedule is posted on ottawa.ca as well. It's captured in this presentation, which you guys can share. That would be the best avenue to come out and voice your concerns or input through the budget process.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I'm going to give the councillors a last opportunity to say a few words if they wish to, just to tie things up or leave the emphasis where they wish it to be. Any words from any of you that you wish to share at the end of this tonight? Councillor Kavanagh.
Just letting you know that we're going to put a lot of this information in our newsletter, including the recording. And the presentation that Cyril shared with us so that people can see it. So that's in our Bay Ward Bulletin, which comes out every Friday. If you haven't subscribed, and you don't have to be necessarily a Bay Ward resident, but just send us an email at bayward@ottawa.ca or go to our website and subscribe. But and of course, we're constantly taking questions on this, and as Cyril's pointed out, depending on your question, there are committees and people can make delegations and share their concerns that way as well. Thanks again, everyone, for coming out.
Councillor Johnson, Councillor Devine.
Just want to thank everybody for, I really do appreciate these conversations. It's so great to see the kinds of questions we get, which I can tell have a lot of compassion and empathy behind them. So I very much appreciate that. And similar to what Councillor Kavanagh was saying, when we finally do see the draft budget, or even now, I appreciate when my constituents, who I'm sure hold a diversity of opinions and priorities, email me to let me know what they are. The Lansdowne example was the Lansdowne vote we have has been a fantastic example of people writing to tell me their positions on a matter of critical import. And this is another example of that. So please do let me know your thoughts on budgeting and taxation, what your concerns are, what you're willing to do, what you're willing to change. It helps us. Thank you, Tim. And thank you, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Johnson.
Yeah, thank you very much. So you can reach our office at collegeward@ottawa.ca. That's collegeward@ottawa.ca. I just noticed in the Q&A that someone was suggesting they really appreciated the online forums and these other places where you can participate, because at committee and council it can be kind of hard to delegate. I'll just mention that you can also submit a written submission. So if there is something that you want to speak to, you can send it to the representative of the city clerk for that committee, and they will include that for reference for all of those councillors that are sitting on committee. So you can do that. You can participate in that way as well. So don't hesitate to think about putting your ideas to paper. And we just really welcome everyone to connect with our office. And big thank you to my team member Heather Perot, who has been on the call and supporting this evening, and to Tim and to Georgie for all of your work coordinating this and making it so seamless for us tonight. So merci beaucoup. And Pat Blanchett.
All right.
And Pat Blanchett. Sorry. And Pat Blanchett. Sorry. And of course, Cyril. Okay.
Yes.
Shouldn't have started naming people. That always happens. Merci.
It gets long, but everybody appreciates it, no doubt. Councillor Devine, you had one last avenue of input you wanted to offer.
Not a very big one. I just forgot to mention my email. Here I am encouraging you to send me your thoughts without telling you the avenue of how to do that. So my email is knoxdalemerivale@ottawa.ca. You can also sign up for my newsletter on seandevine.ca. So I welcome hearing from you. Thanks, Tim. And thank you to Cyril for being here.
Yes, and thank you to everyone who took time out of their evening to come tonight and listen. This process is involved and difficult, but having people who are willing to take time out of their evenings to come and participate in the process makes it worthwhile, and also brings your thoughts to other people. It lets us act as a community together and talk together and understand the various things that are concerning people. And so it's very helpful. So thank you for taking the time out to do that this evening. So we'll wrap that up. Again, the recording of tonight's session will be available. Councillors will make that available in their various ways, no doubt. And should you wish a French language version of the presentation tonight, again, you can contact your councillors' offices in order to receive one of those. We'd be happy to send that along. So thank you again for coming out tonight, and we'll see you again soon.
Night.